Kia ora everybody, and welcome to today's installment of the Australian Water Reform Roadshow. And today we'll be talking about stormwater, climate change, risk and resilience. Today we're lucky to have three very experienced and experts in their field. First, we've got Damien Despromente. He's a director of Foresight Advisory, and Damien's an expert in stormwater management. Alan Foster is a risk resilience and assurance advisor, and she will be talking to us about those topics. Tony Overman's a director of Encader Consulting, and he specializes in climate change, resilience, and sustainability. Just a couple of, I suppose, rules of engagement for today's session. We're cognizant of what's happening in New Zealand and your current situation there and where you are on your journey in your reforms. The sessions are really focusing on what happens in Australia and some of the things we're doing in Australia, and they're just provided to you as a reference point for what you might be looking for in New Zealand as you go forward. Spiker and our panel endeavour to provide an unbiased view in this session. We ask you that you align your questions to the module topic, as while this webinar is being done for DIA and the 3 Water Steering Committee, we ask that you do not ask us questions or ask questions relevant to those bodies as they're not here today. Thank you. I will now, before we go on, I just want to, I suppose, set a bit of a context for today's session, which is really around managing risk and building resilience into it, and obviously stormwater is a major risk factor as we go forward, especially with all the climate change issues going on. As I was thinking about today's session, I thought of something that happened in 1912 when the Titanic sank. The Titanic, as we all know, hit an iceberg and sunk, and it sunk within about an hour and 10 minutes, I think. It sent out a distress signal. Radios had just been, or telegraph radios had just been installed in ships, and it sent out a mayday signal. And there was a ship called the SS Californian that was about 10 miles away, and it did not respond to the distress signal from the Titanic. If it had, it would have probably saved a lot of lives. The reason it hadn't happened is because while the Californian did have radio on board, the radio operator had gone to sleep and switched it off. So no one on the Californian picked up the distress signal. Following that event and an inquiry around it, it was decided that, or it was mandated that all ships will maintain 24-hour watch on the radios, which means they can pick up distress signals, etc. Now, that rule only came in after a disaster had happened. And I think, unfortunately, as humans, we only learn from things like that. We don't necessarily always build in resilience and mitigation into our risks as we go ahead of time. And I think today we're going to be touching on some of that subject. So without any further ado, I will hand you over to Damien, who will talk to us about stormwater. Damien.
Thank you, Mark, and kia ora, everyone. As Mark's mentioned, I'll be going through a bit of an experience that I've had in the last 20 years in my career in stormwater in Australia, and probably with a specific focus on the Victorian market in particular. So just to go through the presentation and what I'll be covering out, I'll be going through an introduction, defining what stormwater means, because it can mean different things in different places. I'll go through a bit about context, history, the future state, and some case studies sort of demonstrating that future state and what it looks like and where we're heading. Just by starting off, I'll be very specific around stormwater. We're not talking about a combined sewer and drainage network in my discussion today or presentation today. It's purely surface water runoff that will run into drains where you see runoff from roads, for example, or from roofs of houses. So it's really a very closed definition of stormwater. I understand there is some historic assets in different countries and states across Victoria, but this is a very specific stormwater presentation. The key facets that I'll be covering out and making reference to throughout the presentation as part of stormwater management are minor drainage networks, major drainage networks, water sensitive urban design, which is in relation to stormwater quality, rivers and creeks, and stormwater harvesting and reuse. And I'll go through a couple of images in the next couple of slides just to demonstrate what each one looks like, so we're all on the same page. So minor drainage is, typically a roadside swales or small drainage pipes, sort of shown in these sort of top diagrams. The next one's major drainage network, which is your large detention basins, large conveyance channels, and large drains. Water sensitive urban design, which is about stormwater quality. Obviously, you can see some images there of various scale assets. Some of close to roads and some that are quite large in terms of wetlands and the like. Rivers and creeks, and I'll make reference to the Yarra River a couple of times through the presentation. And for those who aren't aware, it's one of Melbourne's more prominent waterways that runs through the CBD of Melbourne. And last of all, stormwater harvesting and reuse. This has become a more recent addition to the stormwater mix in Victoria. But as you can see by this diagram, very different scales of opportunities around stormwater harvesting and reuse as well. Contextually, I wanted to start off by just talking about rainfall, which is obviously a big part of stormwater. Obviously, Australia is a very dry climate, and most of Australia is much drier than, has less intensity of rainfall and volume per year than most parts of New Zealand. Looking around the Melbourne or Victorian context, if you made the comparison, would be probably very similar to the east coast of the South Island in terms of rainfall. And you can see quantities of rainfall. We in very small parts of Australia, we end up with over 3 meters of rainfall, which is probably a rare situation. We're in a relatively dry continent all up. In terms of stormwater focus within Melbourne and Victoria and Australia, the main way we see stormwater is around urban flooding, in particular nuisance flooding. So that's the lower events and high risk flooding. So that might be those floods that potential risks to people or homes. Stormwater quality management, waterway health and environmental protection are all interlinked, and stormwater as a resource, which has again become a more recent thing as part of stormwater harvesting and reuse. This diagram here shows the water journey throughout Australia, and particularly looking at the Victorian context. And it's a diagram that was prepared by the Water Sensitive Cities for CRC, which is a Monash University entity. What it's really trying to demonstrate in this image, and I suppose what I'm really trying to highlight around the stormwater journey is, as a state or as a city, Melbourne really only had water supply in the 1860s, a formal water supply system. It wasn't until the 1990s that a sewage system was developed, and it wasn't until the 1970s, almost over 100 years later, after the water supply was established, that there was some consideration around flood protection. So a drained city, in terms of discharging all the stormwater from the city itself, wasn't developed formally until the 1970s, and considered properly until the 1970s. It wasn't until the 1990s that the waterways within the city of Melbourne were considered as an environmental asset. And it wasn't until the 1990s until waterways were considering. So I should go back a step, sorry. It wasn't until the 1990s until a waterway city was a consideration for Melbourne, where we considered the environmental health and sustainability of our waterways. It wasn't until the 2000s, I should say, until a water cycle city that was established that got us thinking about how we could use stormwater as a resource. And that was really driven by a very significant drought that was occurring during the 2000s, the Millennium Drought, where we run short of water in a lot of locations, in particular for public open space irrigation. So it became a major consideration and has grown momentum since then. In terms of contextually around the planning of stormwater and strategic planning of stormwater, Melbourne Water really is an industry leading or a worldwide leader in stormwater management in terms of their approach. Their more recent strategy, the Healthy Waterway strategy, was developed in 2018. And the reason why I reference it is thinking about stormwater holistically, there's probably a few pillars that have been considered in the establishment of this plan and the overall strategy. The first and the most important one is it's very well established and backed by very sound research that's been completed on waterways and stormwater over a very extended period. So the basis of the strategy is really about research. Secondly, environmental economics and demonstrating the value of waterways and potential flow and economic impacts of having poor quality waterways is probably another key point to recognise from this strategy. The obvious thing is waterway works or stormwater works can't occur without on-ground activities. So this plan outlines very strong and detailed on-ground activities, as well as capacity building with its partner organisations, the need to influence government policy around stormwater, and considering collaborative implementation of stormwater, which again, stormwater in Victoria really is managed across a number of organisations. So that collaboration is imperative. The next point I want to just touch on is the governance structure. And there's three really key pillars around stormwater governance within Victoria. At a state government level, they're really concerned about legislation, regulations and policy, in particular around health, environmental and economic impacts. The second level is around catchment management of the actual the stormwater network. And that's really a catchment-based planning and delivery process that's considering waterways, the larger drainage systems, and in some cases, stormwater harvesting. The third level is really a municipal-based considerations at a local government level around planning and delivery, particularly of the smaller drainage network and of stormwater harvesting and reuse. The fourth layer that I've included here, which isn't really part of the governance structure, but more a consideration in this overall thinking in terms of stormwater, is water authorities. And they're really a regional-based organisation base that is really concerned about the long-term potable water considerations for regions. And it's a big consideration now because stormwater is becoming part of that mix of the three waters in terms of long-term planning for sustainability of towns and cities. And I'll touch on an example later on of where and how that sort of looks in terms of a future context. Financing stormwater. This is an interesting one, and I probably could have discussed this at length, but I've kept this pretty simple. In general, there's a number of financing mechanisms at the moment that obviously pay for stormwater management. The first at a council level is the council rates and charges typically pay for stormwater management. It's supplemented by grants, whether that's from a federal or a state level, in order to provide value in this space. The second one is a major drainage network. That's the waterways and major drains. And an example of an organisation that would manage those assets is Melbourne Water. They're typically paid by a waterway levy that's captured via certain billing mechanisms within Victoria. And the last around stormwater harvesting and reuse, it's really only an asset base that's paid by a combination of the two above, but also grants provided by the state and federal government. In terms of funding, I suppose from the outset, I want to be really clear that metropolitan Victoria compared to regional Victoria, their funding far exceeds. So metropolitan Melbourne has a lot of money to spend in stormwater in the grand scheme of things. Having said that, it's still the money that is available probably doesn't stretch as far as it could go. So from a council perspective, in metropolitan Melbourne, the typical budgets around stormwater planning per year and management, I should say, is between $500,000 to $3.5 million annually, and that's a fraction of the required cost from a delivery perspective. Catchment management authorities like a Melbourne Water would typically have about $500 million annually, considering the fact that that money is being distributed across all of metropolitan Melbourne and across a number of initiatives like flood management, waterway management, drainage upgrades, etc. And water authorities' investment into this space is limited and somewhat ad hoc. So it's not something that's an ongoing process in terms of stormwater management. The future state's an interesting thing, and I think a big step was taken in the last 5 years to really consider stormwater management more holistically. And that really is driving us towards this idea of a water sensitive city that I sort of showed in one of the earlier slides. Some of the key factors that are at play with this in particular is integrated water management. So integrated water management is obviously looking at the integration of the three waters in terms of wastewater, potable and stormwater. And the state government in particular has invested quite heavily in strategic frameworks and initiatives to ensure all parties are working together to deliver those IWM outcomes. Climate change, which Tony will touch on a bit later on, is a key consideration, is at the forefront of stormwater planning, whether that's through flood management, considering climate change impacts or sea level rise. Traditional owner and community values is a really big item that's becoming a massive agenda within the stormwater industry in Victoria. traditional owner input in particular has been really important in terms of initial input and ongoing involvement in stormwater management and waterway management within the city and state. And the economic value of stormwater is also something that's becoming quite prominent. And you can see there's some images off to the side there, particularly the water sensitive cities cost analysis tools. There's a lot of work that's been done academically and within the industry to really start to demonstrate and quantify the values of stormwater. So a bit slow there. In terms of the future state, and what I wanted to demonstrate with these next couple of slides is really demonstrating where the industry is heading, but also setting a scene what the future may look like. This particular example is demonstrating the connection between community values and stormwater, and it's around the Reimagining Creeks program, which is a Melbourne water initiative. This particular project's the Arnold's Creek Reimagining project. You can see the images on the left-hand side, was the original waterway. And those on the right are the sort of rehabilitation of the waterways, creating great community spaces, environmental assets, and a real drastic change from what was originally there. In particular, the city of Melton is a municipality located in the western parts of metropolitan Melbourne in a lower socio-economic sort of area. So these sort of assets are becoming really critical in terms of providing great assets for people in those communities. The second is around precinct planning and stormwater, and it's not generally the connected link in terms of thinking about precinct planning and stormwater. They're generally not one and the same. This is a project that I'm currently working on with Wyndham City Council and Greater Western Water. It's an extended. The actual asset is a main outfall sewer that was originally used to convey sewer from metropolitan Melbourne or the city of Melbourne to a wastewater treatment plant. So it's quite extensive sewer. You can see some images of it on the left-hand side. It's about 30 odd kilometres long, and the overall width of the reserve is about 40 metres wide. So it's quite a substantial green link in an area that currently at the moment doesn't have available great community space. So this particular project not only provides a stormwater harvesting and reuse opportunity, but also a great community greening asset for an area that really is deprived of that sort of asset at the moment. I've got a couple left. So the last couple is the Sunbury Water Futures project. What this reflects is how stormwater is being considered with the community around long-term water security. So Sunbury itself is a satellite suburb of Melbourne. It's kind of disconnected from metropolitan Melbourne itself. So it has its own very discrete water supply system and is surrounded by a number of very high value waterways that have, for example, platypus and other key sort of fauna living in them. This sort of program has been a long sort of running program with the community to look at what are the long-term, getting them to understand stormwater and overall water management, and getting their opinions on what is the best way to manage impacts to waterways, but also considering how stormwater could potentially be used for long-term water augmentation projects. So it's looking at potential reuse of stormwater into the potable system into the future. By no means has this been resolved, but it's a demonstration of organisations thinking about and working with the community quite strongly to make decisions around alternative water supplies into the future. And the last slide is really around long-term protection of waterways and the initiatives that are currently being implemented within Victoria and Melbourne. So the Yarra River, as mentioned earlier, is a very prized waterway within Melbourne. In 2017, the Yarra River Protection Act was enacted, and it was an act developed in close consultation with traditional owners for the region. And so what that really means it was one of the first, or it has been the first, obviously, in Australia in terms of implementing an act of this sort. And it's also really important because it gives opportunity to traditional owners as well as key community groups and technical experts to provide long-term input to the management of that waterway into the future. So the Birrong Council, is now in its third year, is thinking about or is part of the long-term governance and management of that waterway. And what I mean by governance, I mean things like long-term planning, management initiatives, maintenance, operations, and the like. And the second one shown on the right-hand side is the Mary Creek example. So what that is, the Mary Creek Management Committee have had a long-term relationship with the Mary Creek. That's a community group that's really turned that creek into what was originally a place where a lot of wastewater and contaminants were dumped. Now it's really turned into a program of a parklands and long-term management plan for that waterway that is being run by a community group. So what this last one demonstrates is a really strong link of both government and community establishing great community assets and managing waterways into the future. And that's pretty much it from me on this one. And if anyone has any further questions beyond this presentation, my contact details are provided there. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. Questions will be, I suppose, discussed after everyone finishes, and there's already one for you that I've seen, so we'll get there. Now I will hand over to Helen, who'll talk to us about risk. Helen?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm just waiting for my...
All right.
I'll wait for the slides to be... Here we go. Thank you. Kia ora. Thank you for allowing me to present at this webinar. My name's Helen Foster. I have been within the water industry for too many years. I'm here today to talk about risk and resilience being the two areas of my professional focus in the last years. So we'll move on. And apologies, these slides do take some time. So my discussion today will focus on briefly on managing risk, and then we'll go through risk and resilience, the need for both, right through to the types of contingencies you can have in place as part of the water sector, including an example of resilience framework models and considerations moving forward. So as we can see, risk is the impact of uncertainty on objectives. That is the definition of risk in the Australian New Zealand standard 31,000, which is a risk management standard. It has been around since 2018, and it really does focus on risk in any organisation type, context. It's really important that risk is considered when developing strategy or developing an organisation from scratch, and it should be also considered as you go through and work through your strategy objectives and develop those objectives, and making sure that risk is being considered right throughout. So the connection between risk and resilience is that risk is the first order that you should be considering as part of strategic objectives. The second order is strategic and adaptive capacity, and that's where resilience comes in. So risk management actually underpins resilience, and without risk, resilience cannot exist. So there could be impact on life, property and infrastructure, and more complex and long-term risks require separate assessment and really detailed assessment. And this happens from a government point of view, right through to a sectoral point of view, right through to an authority point of view. So a truly resilient organisation is one that's just not there to get through crises and disruptive events as it occurs. It's all about being sure that you can have the foresight and the situational awareness to prevent potential crises and disruptions, and that you can actually turn those crises and disruptions into some sort of opportunity for your organisation, not just to bounce back, not just to bounce forward, but to be better as you go forward. So if resilience is the organisation's ability to absorb and adapt, that's a definition. Another simple definition is that resilience is the opportunity to bounce forward, as I've just said, after a crisis, and it arises from the growing need to manage uncertainty of complex and interconnected societies and economies. As you would know, with COVID-19, there's been an opportunity there to demonstrate resilience from a government perspective, a sector perspective, right through to an organisation perspective. So Australia has been focused on resilience for a number of years, for a good 15 years or so that I've been involved with the government. And the key outcome of the initial government's critical infrastructure resilience strategy was to develop the understanding and application of organisation resilience. The water sector here in Australia was closely involved in the development of that CIR strategy. And what has happened is now that the government has resilience embedded in some of the organisations and indeed a lot of sectors under critical infrastructure such as energy, food and grocery, etc. The focus now is on emerging risks, of which we've seen quite a few emerging risks in disruptions here in Australia and particularly in Victoria over the last 2 years. And emerging risks, they're a little bit different than normal risks, as in traditional risks. They have less information regarding them because they often haven't emerged before, and so they have unknown quantities. There's the data for those risks is not generally available because there's no historical information regarding those risks, and they are difficult to consider the impact of those and whether or not the impact will be at one point of an organisation or in multiple points of an organisation or a community. So emerging risks are a little bit different than what we would consider to be traditional organisation risks. All right, so in the government CIR strategy, and also for those that are familiar with new resilient organisations in New Zealand, this is a model of attributes and indicators that has been used and has been included in Australian disaster resilience documentation for a number of years. It focuses on 3 major attributes, those being leadership and culture, being change ready, and developing the networks and relationships needed to make sure that the resilience is within communities and within organisations. On the outside of those 3 attributes are indicators that support those attributes, and they expand upon and describe organisational behaviours that are required to contribute to resilience of an organisation. And what these attributes and indicators do in a business as usual environment is enable a robust and agile response to and recovery from any disruptions or adverse events. So why do we look at resilience? It's because we've got, we have to maintain continuity, we have to deliver on regulatory obligations, and this is irrespective of which industry you're in, and we have to, there's an importance in maintaining reputation. And in the rapidly changing world in which we live in at the moment, there's rise to greater uncertainty and those emerging risks that we spoke about earlier. So the issue here is that we have to enhance resilience. We actually have to focus on resilience, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And it has to be embedded in business as usual performance. So it's a consideration right from the start of building a new strategy or building a new organisation. So within the water sector, resilience has been an emerging theme. It has had ebbs and flows. It has been the focus nationally, as I mentioned before, and the water sector certainly has been involved in the development of the resilience framework for Australia. From a state and territory point of view, there are various forms of resilience strategies, models and frameworks in states and territories. In Victoria, for example, we have our own critical infrastructure resilience strategy and plan. So it's not just here in Australia, there is also a lot of work being done in the UK. There's also a lot of work being done in the US. There was a recent survey in the US that indicated resiliency concerns for about 200 water providers or stakeholders. The main concerns for them with respect to resilience was around the failure of their infrastructure, so their vital infrastructure. It was also around cyber attacks. There was a focus on extended drought and supply issues. Unfortunately, impact of climate change was a little bit lower on their list of resiliency concerns, but I'm sure that will be changing as regulations are being developed. So here in Victoria, the key risks that have been defined in Victorian critical infrastructure resilience strategy are around cybersecurity, drought, fire, liquid fuel shortage, severe weather events, of which Victoria's had a few, floods and storms, and pandemic. So they're very similar to those that you would find in the UK and also in the US survey that I've just previously mentioned. So getting back to what Victoria has faced, 2019 to 20, there's been a broad range of threats, risks and disruptions, from floods and fires, as you can see, fires, the impact on waterways, fires, the impact on infrastructure, and floods. And we're currently, the east coast of Australia is currently in the midst of a flood at the moment. So thank you to the different changing weather patterns that we have at the moment. So there's been an increase in emergencies, and these are not bound by geography. So this can be across multiple parts of the state or in multiple states, as we've seen in the last couple of years. They're also of longer duration. These events are of longer duration, which really stretches an organisation's capability and their resources and their reserves in dealing with these disruptions. And there's also potential for concurrent emergencies. You know, bushfires are followed by flood after rainfall. And there's also, to assist with resolving and recovering from these disruptions, there's also the impact of global supply chain issues to deal with as well. And this is what happens when we do have that disruption. If water supply, if we don't have the contingencies required to deliver our product, such as water within Australian drinking water guidelines, we have issues with respect to health services, right through to a loss of water for manufacturing processes. So bushfire, for example, has an impact on vegetation, soils, ash and silt in the water supply, from floods, which we're experiencing, turbidity, pathogens, and some extra nutrient loads. In drought, we have biological activities. We also have turbidity. Then we have the combination of those, drought versus rainfall, bushfires versus rainfall, where we can have aspects leading to algae, etc. So without managing the resilience of these systems, without having the ability to recover, we have impacts on our customers, as you can see on this slide. And we're not moving. There we go. So the water sector has looked at PPRR, which is Planning, Prevention, Response and Recovery. That's a tenet within the Australian Disaster Strategy and also framework. It's also consistent with the New Zealand strategy for emergencies as well. And as we can see here, we need to plan for robust and resilient assets, prepare for the disruption and adverse events. We have to have rapid and capable incident management. The response, therefore, has to make sure that we can secure and deliver a diversity of supply so that recovery for our customers and our community is guaranteed. And this is what we determine to be a resilience approach within the industry. So if we are to be resilient, we have to plan for it up front. As I've said before, we have to have a clear vision. We have to be outward looking as well as outward looking to make sure that we're working within the context of our environment and our communities. We also have to make sure that we've got the right level of performance and a focus on resilience to make sure that we have those indicators of leadership and culture, and that we have the opportunity to learn from our experience. Resilience is also a no blame culture. We also have to make sure that we've got networking, and we work with our other sector agencies and authorities, and we use others as required. So the other aspect of being resilient is to understand your critical infrastructure, and that's been a focus, of course, of the critical infrastructure resilience strategy, both state-based and nationally here in Australia. And as you can see on screen, that's what critical infrastructure is defined as: physical facility supply chains that would, if rendered unavailable, would impact the social and economic well-being of Australia. This is what we would look at to be critical independency, and this is part of identifying your critical infrastructure, is to know where your critical independencies are. As we can see here, water is has independencies in power, communications, etc., and all the other sectors, power, communications, food and grocery, transport, actually depend on water as well. So power is our key. Communications is also key for managing our SCADA networks and making sure that we have an understanding of the capability of our plant and equipment. Oil is necessary for that plant and equipment, and one of our critical inputs, of course, is chemicals, and that hits that's the issues associated with supply chain risks that we talked about earlier. All right, to put it all together as part of a resilient organisation, you look at the risks, likelihood, consequence, determine your risk level. Look at resilience, making sure you have those principles and attributes in place, change ready, etc. Identify your infrastructure and then provide a criticality rating for that. It's specific to your state or jurisdiction here in Australia, and it ranges from vital to vital, and it might be state significant or it might be just community significant. We have to look at the impacts and the risk consequences, what we have listed there, including interdependencies. We have to have recovery, so maximum allowable outage times have to be defined, and the quality of your recovery. Is it business as usual that you're aiming for, or is it a degraded version of business as usual? The redundancies, what type of redundancies you have. Do you not have any? Is a single redundancy, therefore that becomes critical in its own right, or do you have multiple areas where you can actually look at bypassing, using other sources, etc., which is what we would find with mutual aid. So mutual aid is a contingency plan here in Victoria and also in Australia. So we have a mutual aid guideline, mutual aid guidelines that have been in place for, again, a number of years. They've been activated on many occasions, from droughts, bushfires, etc. We also activated mutual aid guidelines after the Christchurch earthquake. We actually responded here from Australian water industry with the delivery of lots of planted equipment from multiple companies here in Australia, and we deployed that equipment and the resources to manage that equipment and to run it for a number of months to assist with the wastewater system rebuild, and or just to provide some wastewater services within Christchurch after the earthquake. We both, Australia and New Zealand, benefited from the use of mutual aid in that respect. We learned a lot from that, and certainly assume we helped Christchurch with their wastewater system in the meantime. This is what mutual aid is, and it has a process behind it. So there are guidelines, there's an agreement where the mutual aid provider and the receiver enter into an agreement as to what mutual aid be provided, who pays for what, etc. This is the governance around that here in Victoria, and there are different ones around different states. As you can see, the mutual aid Water Corporation Mutual Aid Cell is what is stood up to make sure that those resources are placed in the correct area, they are the right resources, and that any plant and equipment that is provided is also returned at the end. Putting this all together, and this, the stress here is there's a whole lot of moving parts with respect to risk and resilience. You start off with risk and you moved, and that's your primary tenet, and then you move forward into resilience, and there's lots of moving parts to make sure that you've got the framework elements required to ensure that you've got resilience around infrastructure, people, also your systems. So it's, if we look at PPRR again, we start off with risk management, have the assurance processes, the competent and trained people, and by competent and trained people, that takes into account that they're trained in understanding resilience, but also trained in managing incidents and emergencies. And we have a doctrine that we use here in Australia, which is very similar to what New Zealand uses as well. So that goes through the response with an incident plan. Also, crisis management is vitally important as part of response. if it's just to manage reputation, but also to make sure that regulators, etc., are kept well informed. The other thing, of course, is that we have continuity and response and contingency plans down the bottom. The whole thing needs to be reviewed from an assurance perspective to determine whether or not it's hitting the mark, but also to identify any areas of improvement that are required, and that feeds back into the planning process. Okay, speaking of the Titanic, what we have here is a snapshot of where consideration may already be with respect to mandate for change, community involvement, the maturity of the sector, water sector in New Zealand, and the goal of having safe water for all communities, which is very pertinent. The things that should be considered, so these are the things that need to be planned in advance. This is what will build that resilience and manage those risks. So it's a focus on emerging risk. It's a real focus on doing those risk assessments at a corporate, a financial and an operational level. It's understanding what extreme events may bring to an organisation or to the sector. It's taking into consideration population growth and making sure you've got the supply to match that population growth. It's looking at the infrastructure system vulnerabilities from aging infrastructure through to critical controls. Interdependencies, we looked at the interdependencies for water and that it was a vital sector for other sectors such as power, etc. A change management process needs to be built in all the way through because we're talking major change. I would imagine training, testing and competency is also vitally important to make sure that people have got the level of capability to deliver all the above. So as part of planning for reform, consideration of risk, uncertainty and disruption across all areas is required. This is a lesson that Australia has learned over a number of years and has been able to put into practice the resilience of these systems and the understanding of critical infrastructure should there be a disruption. So it's the right skills, it's the right leadership, it's the right culture. It's also the understanding that we're facing, a changing climate and populations, etc., and how we should go about managing that in advance. So we're planning in advance, and resilience is therefore something that helps you manage risk. It's actually essential in a world that's full of risk, which is what we know to be the case at the moment. My information is available. If you have any questions, please contact me on the information you see on the screen. I thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Helen. There's a couple of questions for you too, ready to go when we conclude. Tony, I'll hand it over to Tony Overman now, sorry.
Sorry, Mark, just waiting for the video to kick in.
It's okay. Just introduce yourself, maybe.
Good. Kia ora, everyone. Tony Overman's my name. I'm an environmental sustainability professional. I've been in that space for more than 30 years, working in water utilities, catchment management authorities, departments, local government, and also in consulting. And my speciality is in facilitating collaborative approaches at a system level in climate action, corporate sustainability, and social responsibility. So I'm briefly going to talk today about sustainability and how it may relate to the Three Waters agenda in New Zealand, based on our experiences here in Victoria, which is where I'm from. And I'm firstly going to assume that you all appreciate that being a socially and environmentally sustainable business is as important as being an economically sustainable business. And I'm also going to stay at the system level and won't be getting too much into the detail and picking up on some of the points that have been raised by Damien and Helen. So first thing I will do is present the Sustainable Development Goals as a sustainability framework for the water sector that you might wish to consider. And then we'll talk about the Climate change, what have been the impacts on the Victorian water sector and how have they responded, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation? And then I'll finish with integrated water management and how effectively it is a systematic response to trying to build better cohesion within the water sector in this part of the world. So the global Sustainable Development Goals were developed by the United Nations in 2015. What do? They actually define the global priorities for sustainable development or sustainability. They're much broader than previous concepts or definitions of sustainability, and that's one of the powers that they have. In fact, before 2015, there was a plethora of sustainability frameworks that anyone could choose from. And this has really lined things up and made it much simpler. Importantly, they set aspirations for 2030, and that's particularly important for organisations like yourselves who are about to commence a journey, that 10-year medium-term time horizon. They seek to mobilise action for collective impact. How can we all work together to do something that is bigger than just if we did it ourselves? And they apply to governments, business, and the community. So why would a water utility or a water organisation choose to use the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, they're globally accepted. So they provide a common language, which is important for your stakeholders, for your staff, for your boards, and for your community. They allow you to get alignment so that your efforts are part of the global solutions. They provide guidance. Each goal comes with targets and now sub-targets, which can help you set your own directions. They can help you with commitment. They show that sustainability is part of your business and it's a broad suite. And cohesion, they help build support and engagement around what you're trying to do in your sustainability agendas, and also help you build partnerships for synergies. So what sustainable development goals might be relevant to a water utility? The key question about how to use the Sustainable Development Goals is the issue of materiality. What really matters to the organisation that you're in? If you're in the water and sewer services industry or sector, then clearly the delivery of clean water and sanitation, goal number 6, would be important. But also, so might be aquatic environments, meaning the aquatic habitats where you're taking your water from, such as rivers or waterways. Climate change may be important to you because you use a lot of energy or you need to adapt, as Helen has already described. Waste could be an issue because you've got to get rid of the waste products from your sewage treatment plants, biosolids and the like. And what about if you're involved in stormwater services? Well, as Damien highlighted, being sustainable cities and communities includes the challenges of managing flood and storm damage in urban areas, which should be a material goal for yourselves. Aquatic environments as well. Damien talked about the value of green and blue infrastructure, particularly waterways and corridors through urban areas. So stormwater has massive impacts on aquatic environments, and obviously in New Zealand there's some real challenges with the amount of water that's been taken out of some of these waterways. Green-blue infrastructure. You may not have heard this term, but it's a combination of two things over here. It's the water-sensitive urban design piece that Damien talked about earlier, but it's also about the value of retaining stormwater in the urban environment for living vegetation, for the turf, for the trees, for the plants, for the gardens and the parks. And another one you may be interested in is the terrestrial biodiversity. So what stormwater and its role in actually keeping things alive in urban environments. I'm now just going to focus a little bit on climate changes and how they've impacted Victoria. So it's interesting when Helen talks about resilience, and she highlighted the rethinking that's happened around resilience, or the prominence of resilience, I suppose, since the millennium drought. And to some extent, we knew these things were coming, but it took us a while to respond. But this slide here shows that the sorts of challenges that we are finding in our small state of Australia are quite disconcerting. You know, we've already seen a 1 degree temperature rise over the last 100 years. We're seeing, as you would have seen on the news, the fire danger in spring. In fact, one of the real challenges that we have at the moment, and it's evident in my part of the world, I'm down near the Great Ocean Road, is they're trying to burn off at the moment because the windows for burning off in autumn and spring are becoming smaller and smaller. So the ability to actually manage those wildfire risks is actually being reduced. There's an interesting box there in the what we can expect in about, this is in about the next 30 to 50 years. Many of you may understand the geography of Victoria, but we have what's called the Great Dividing Range, which runs right along the eastern seaboard, and it runs through the middle of the state, about 100 kilometres due north of Melbourne. The north of the state is characterised by, it's much warmer and it's much drier, and there's much more solar radiation than there is south of the Divide. And so there's always been a great difference between south of the Divide and north of the Divide in terms of climate. But interestingly, within 30 to 40 years, Melbourne's climate is expected to be the same as Wangaratta, which is actually about 3 hours north of Melbourne, closer to the Murray River. Thanks, Craig. And also for a town like Geelong, which is my major regional centre, it's expecting to have a climate similar to Shepparton, which is out in the middle of the Goulburn Murray Irrigation District. So that's the sort of change that we're likely to expect. And with that comes all the challenges that Helen and Damien have talked about. One of the biggest issues from a water perspective is the declining cool season rainfall. And of course, if we get declining cool season rainfall, that means that we still will get high evaporation over summer. So some of our dams may never stay full. So yeah, these are some of the things that we're dealing with. Helen's talked a little bit about the impacts of climate change, and this slide just sort of summarises those maybe a bit more, talking to some of the other key things. I particularly want to draw your attention to the community and the environmental impacts. The community is going to suffer from heat-related stress more and more. If you think about it, there's been some work done in Geelong, which showed that on a 35-degree day, it can be up to 65 degrees of the pavement level in the centre of our city. That's at a level that you just do not want to be outside. So that's the sort of stress that is going to be on people, and that's experienced particularly more so by vulnerable groups and people who don't have the right housing to be able to stay cool on those days. Of course, the heat's going to exacerbate what we now know as the urban heat island effect, which is where urban areas can be up to 5 degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside. This is going to lead to reduced active travel. So people will be walking, cycling, staying outdoors less. And there's going to be reduced outdoor recreation, which highlights the importance of green-blue infrastructure, places which are shaded, places with trees, places that are green where people can go and spend their time. And that's become more evident even with the advent of COVID and the lockdowns. The importance of those green, blue parks, gardens, waterways is now critical, and it's starting to be regarded as important infrastructure, similar to the pipes and pumps and roads that we build. From an environmental perspective, wildfire had a massive impact on the biodiversity across the Eastern Australia. We've seen extreme habitat loss of our rivers and creeks, and we're seeing loss of biodiversity. And one of the particular problems is the rise of pest plants and animals which are filling these niches. So how can we respond, and how are we adapting to this? Well, at the risk of adding another resilience framework to the mix, and Helen's already given us a couple in her presentation, I'm going to just talk about resilience at a systems level. And what I'm doing here is I'm using a model that was first developed by in the ecological disciplines back in the 1960s about resilient ecological systems. And what they found back then with different terminology was that there were four main characteristics of resilient ecological systems. One was efficiency in resource use, efficiency in how those systems worked with each other. The second one was adaptability. So were the existing forms and entities that were in the system, were they able to adapt to minor changes that were happening in the broader context? The third one was diversity. Was there enough diversity of forms and entities within the system that will allow that could do similar functions? And the fourth one was cohesion. Cohesion is about the connections, the linkages between all the entities within the systems. So I'm going to use that as a model of hindsight to have a look at how the water sector has adapted to climate action and later to climate mitigation. So what we can see in hindsight in Victoria is that the first critical response to, say, the water security problem was around network efficiencies. How do we save water in these networks? How do we move water around in a way that means that we're not wasting it? And that included things like lining channels. It included things like covering basins. So all about being more effective in how the networks were being used. It also included things like taking water from one dam to another where there's going to be less evaporation if we could. The second thing that we looked at and that we did was we adapted the existing supplies from a water security perspective. When I say adapting, I'm saying we looked at what we had and then we said, how can we make those things work better together or work better on their own? And adapting, a good example of this is the water grid in Victoria. Prior to the Millennium Drought, we had a whole variety of different water supply systems that largely weren't connected with each other. And so the water grid allowed us to move water from one place to another and deal with shortages where we could get water to them in a more effective way. The third response to that was diversifying supplies. And a good example of this is in our own region, we always had a groundwater resource. It was considered a drought response supply, but it was activated early in the drought to try and bring that water online. And in hindsight, if it wasn't, then the Geelong region probably would have run out of water. But at a broader scale, the big diversification of supplies was the building of desalination plants right across Australia, not just in Victoria. And other things that Damien has talked about as well in terms of stormwater. Whereas, 15, 20 years ago, stormwater reuse was a very niche thing. Now it's becoming much more commonly accepted. And of course, the fourth element of that was using recycled water. Most of the recycled water up until the early 2000s was pretty much being discharged to waterways or out to sea. And now it's very rare that, yeah, sure, Mark. It's very rare to see that there will be recycled water just disposed of to sea. And the final one was community cohesion and really getting the community on board with that whole water efficiency and effectiveness message. Look, I'm going to leave the green blue infrastructure one there and I'll go on to the next slide just in the interest of time. But from a mitigation perspective, using a similar approach, the drivers were pretty big. The water sector, this is 4 years ago, spends about $500 million on energy. It's probably less now because many of those companies have, particularly in Victoria, about 80% of Victorian water utilities now get renewable energy through a power purchase agreement. It's much cheaper, it's got long-term security, and it's zero emissions. The environmental drivers were very important in this context, and really the social drivers. You know, the community awareness around climate action, they expect water utilities to do something about it. And what did we do? Well, efficiency in energy use was the first thing. Adaptability again, recovering waste energy, particularly from our wastewater treatment plants. And we've diversified, we've switched to renewables, and more important, now we're looking at offsets. And interestingly about the cohesion piece there's a really strong demand for more localised offsets that may not be necessarily Australian carbon credit units or clean development mechanism, but they're regionally recognised as offsetting and emissions. I'll very briefly touch on integrated water management. Look, there's been fragmented management of the water cycle as a system in Victoria. We're often held up as a model, but we do have we have a lot of different players. That has led to a lot of conflicts and missed opportunities, and Damien touched on some areas where we're actually making some gains. There was recognition after the Millennium Drought that we needed to get these agencies together and collaborate. There wasn't really a great process as to how to do that, and integrated water management has filled that void. It's outcome focused. It's outcome focused on livability and resilience. It's about the whole system. It's meant to be connected, and it's meant to be a facilitated process. Very briefly, what do we do there? Well, we get people together. We build a shared understanding of the issues and the goals. We go through a co-design process where we look at all the options and we try and co-design the solutions. We develop action plans, and we try and get support for collaborative implementation. I think Damien highlighted some examples earlier where that's really happening in practice. So just in wrapping up, what are the challenges and opportunities as it relates to a sustainable three waters sector in New Zealand? Well, in Victoria, it's really been about climate change, population growth, big drivers, major impacts on the businesses of the water sector. And as is highlighted by Damien with the stormwater, there's limitations on what funding's available, whether it's fixed prices or rate capping. Rising community expectations. People want more livable cities and towns. They want their organisations to take responsibility across all the suite of environmental and social sustainability dimensions. But I think there's some really great opportunities, and I think, you know, particularly Damien's talk has highlighted that the water sector are well placed. They can be leaders. They can, through their own actions and through advocacy, they can be enablers by facilitating, such as through the integrated water management forums and networks, and collaboration. They can put some cash on the table and get things started. And importantly, they're critical go-to connectors through their communications and through their networks. So I think sustainability is a lens for organisational resilience, you know, and I think the Sustainable Development Goals are an accepted framework to really help you operationalise sustainability. So thanks for your time, and I'll leave it there, Mark.
We've got some questions here, and the first one is for you, Damien. It's from Mayor Alex Walker. She's the Mayor of Central Hawke's Bay. And she says, thanks, Damon. I like the reimagining Creek story from Melton. The question is, who identifies and prioritises where community environmental wellbeing projects like this will happen? Is it all by water suppliers or guided by spatial planning from council plans?
It's a good question, and given time, I'd probably didn't touch on the detail, but the prioritisation typically comes from at a catchment management level. In particular, the Reimagining Creeks program is built on two key drivers. Number one is waterway health. So we've got a very clear map across metropolitan Melbourne of waterway health and long-term impacts. So that's a key driver. And the second is, like Tony mentioned in his presentation about socially disadvantaged, and where those two come together, that's generally where priority projects lie for those reimagining projects. And I might answer the second question too, Mark, while I'm at it on the same topic. They are typically a co-design process in terms of their development. And by co-design, it typically means that the community and traditional owners and key stakeholders are along the journey for a design development point of view, and typically involved in probably 2 or 3 key stages along the design development, whether that's initially through defining constraints and opportunities for the project, and then in subsequent design development processes, so they can comment on designs as they're being developed.
Another question from Anna Kerno, which is for Helen. Helen, do you have an example of where resilience planning was effective in addressing the impact of an incident? And can you talk?
Yes, I've got a few. So I'll just briefly touch on one. 2011, there were floods along the East Coast, similar to what we're facing today. Because of the resilience framework that was in place, we had networks already established. We were change ready. The request came from Queensland to help assist with the managing of the flood issue that they had there. So it was a huge incident affecting critical infrastructure for water supply in Queensland. So they flew people like myself up to assist and actually work in their incident control centre with their emergency services personnel to make sure that they had the right level of resources. We also started to look at mutual aid from that perspective and making sure critical infrastructure was covered. We also did the same. We came down the East Coast and had to do that in Victoria because the floods followed us down, and there was a huge task force. Multiple agencies set up a task force to manage floods in the Mildura district, which is a big wine growing and fruit growing district. So we managed the risks in there and managed that incident for them.
A question, perhaps a combined question for Tony and Helen. We talk about risk resilience and risk mitigation. From a, I suppose, strategy perspective, what's the difference?
Resilience is putting the planning behind it. Managing an emergency or managing an incident is all about just one part of the organization addressing that event or addressing that issue. Resilience is a planned approach. So when something does happen, you are actually ready and prepared in advance for things happening. So you've got that change ready philosophy ready to, and you're ready to activate, and you can take a planned approach knowing that your resources are there, available, trained, and you've got the right level of resources and equipment to deal with it, rather than being totally reactive. So it's more proactive.
I suppose that's the concept of resilience. I think you can use at different levels, Mark, and I think that the way that I look at it is that I try and think about a resilient system. So being a state of the system so that it can do those sorts of things that Helen's talking about, respond, bounce back, those sorts of things. But instead of the what it can do, I think about what are the characteristics that it needs to exhibit. And interestingly, Helen just mentioned before, she used an example of what I would say is the cohesion characteristic of a resilient system when she talked about the ability of the entities to actually share their resources because they were communicating and had relationships up and down the eastern seaboard when there were floods. So to me, that's an example of something that's building, that's a tactic that's building the desired characteristic of a cohesive system. So I think of it more in those sense as opposed to at an operational level, I suppose.
Okay, great. I suppose we're looking at risk horizons. I heard that term as we're planning for this session, I think from you, Helen, as opposed to kind of a risk assessment. We're looking well ahead here and saying these are mitigations really addressing our risk horizon to some extent, not mitigation. So resilience is looking at our risk horizon. Is that another way of looking at it?
Yeah, so horizon scanning is a tool that is a risk management tool, but for particular reference with emerging risks, horizon scanning should be done on a regular basis, given the rapidly changing world in which we live in. And an example of that, in 2019, the World Economic Forum Risk Radar had a pandemic or similar as a very low possibility. High consequence, low possibility. Again, it changed quite rapidly in 2020 in that report, and now it's one of the featured risks that issues that we're dealing with at the moment. So it's really important to know what's happening outside your organisation, and that's the external context that risk management asks you to consider, but also to become more resilient, you actually have to know what might have an impact on your organisation. Horizon scanning is one tool. It's a pretty good tool. The World Economic Forum report provides you with, very, very broad areas that you can take and tailor to your organisation.
Great, thanks. We'll say on you, Helen. There's a question here from Mayor Alex. She says, thanks, Helen. I am interested in how the risk mitigation and resilience work translates to a micro level. For instance, to small isolated coastal communities. Does the high level system view you have described translate well to this micro community level?
Yes, it does. Again, from a risk management point of view, that's contextual and can fit any size of organisation or any type. The same with a resilience model. You don't need to have all the elements that I demonstrated in the models. You actually tailor it to suit the organisation. But the perfect scenario is to actually look at the neighbouring areas to make sure that you've got those relationships set up. That's part of being resilient, having those networks and relationships so you can draw on those other areas, other sectors even, to help you with your mitigation and to help you with your response and recovery. Always happens here in Victoria. We help with fires for councils that are managing water supplies that aren't actually water authority supplies. We help them with reintroducing a water supply to a bushfire area as part of that mutual aid structure that I demonstrated. So again, it's building the structure and the governance around it.
Great, thanks, Helen. There's a question here from Anna Kerno, and I might pose it to you first, Damien. It is about risk and resilience, but I did have a question in my back of my mind in terms of how we're structured. The question is, how has the structure of waters, say 3 waters in Australia, affected risk and resilience? And maybe touch on the fact that stormwater is not managed by the same organisations that manage other waters.
Yeah, I'll probably start with that, and probably Tony can pick up the remaining risks. I think from a stormwater point of view, the structure is such that councils, and predominantly like an organisation like a Melbourne Water, which is a catchment management authority, are really there to manage risks around flooding in particular. I think the broader conversation about stormwater quality outcomes and the risks associated with stormwater quality aren't as straightforward and nor planned as well as they should be. So we've got an organisation like EPA who works with Melbourne Water with contamination of waterways, but it's something that isn't at the forefront or as prominent as flooding. So as much as I think my image a bit earlier, my presentation talked about us being a water sensitive city, from a risk point of view, I think there's a bit of work to be done around long-term planning and management of waterway health risks. It's not that it's not there, but it's in its infancy, I would say, compared to flood management. Tony, if you don't mind answering the question about the other 2 waters, that's all right.
Not really, but I'll give it a go. I think in terms of the structures, maybe at a very high level, I think that specialisation in our sector has actually led to some inefficiencies, some closed-minded thinking. And I think that what we've seen over the last 20 years is the water sector, meaning, what Damien said, the stormwater, the water, the potable water, the sewer and the waterways. I think that sector has now built bridges with each other and, particularly reached out, like local government and water utilities now work well together across Australia, and some of them overlap in terms of their responsibilities. So I think that piece has been good. There's been a lot more cohesion within the water sector. I think the challenge now, and it's recognised by WASA, and I'm sure Adam would have touched on this, is the water sector now reaching out to the other sectors, such as the health sector, such as the justice sector, all the other sectors that it should be talking to think about their role in a resilient urban form and system. So I think there's been an opening up of mindsets. Firstly, that opening up was to everyone else in the sector, and now it's reaching out and spanning, building bridges to other sectors. And I think that's a good thing, because it means that different perspectives are coming in around this question of what's the water sector's role in a resilient community.
Thanks, Tony. So there's a question here, and I've picked it up, Alex, so from Mayor Alex, about water security. And she's saying it's great to think about the circular use of stormwater for use in green spaces. But does your model also think about the role of stormwater in the maintenance of river flows? Maybe I'll start with you, Damien.
Yeah. So I think the structure within Victoria and Australia has had a pretty prominent feature of environmental flows in stormwater management, and it exists at a regional level for some of our bigger waterways, as well as to some extent at an urban context. So I think what I suppose in a region like the Murray-Darling Basin, which is a critical irrigation district in Australia, I think at times the environmental flow impact is sort of dampened by economic drivers and social drivers. So it's in the mix, but I still think its prominence is probably still something that we need to work on, because at times when the pressure is applied, the environmental flows may be the thing that may drop off the radar. Having said that, I think we're doing a lot of work in Victoria again around traditional owner waterway management, and making sure traditional owners also have their say about the long-term understanding and management of waterways, which is a new inclusion. That's again, it's in its infancy, but something that is prominent and heightening people's awareness of waterways as a living entity. So I think we do recognise those environmental flows of waterways. I think their long-term management, and when pressure is applied via drought or other means, those sort of policies come into question, but they are prominent in our planning. And Tony or Helen, please jump in if you feel like that hasn't been answered completely.
Okay, they seem happy with that. I'll just, again, you've touched on it already, but I will read the question from Alex again, continuing the second question. And she's saying, flow management in our drying climate is important in New Zealand as we take the Matauranga Maori, I hope I pronounced that right, perspective in maintaining the living ecosystem. Does anyone have any experience in how these kinds of trade-offs are made? And I think, Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think here you're asking about the trade-offs between using, I suppose, managing environmental needs and looking after the environment versus I suppose, harvesting stormwater for other needs also. Is that how, have I understood the question right? Perhaps one of you can just touch on it while Alex responds.
I think Alex might have just responded to it there, just saying it has been touched on.
Okay, Damien's touched on it. So, okay, sorry. I
was going to say, Mark, it is worth noting that for most of the major towns in Victoria, where they require passing flows, those passing flows are actually set way back before environmental requirements were defined. They were actually passing flows from dams and reservoirs for stock and domestic purposes. And so the concept of environmental flows is really only about 30 years old. And to some extent, the environment's been playing catch up in many of our major rivers in Victoria, because a lot of the flow has been harnessed for consumptive use.
Great, thanks. I suppose yesterday, I've got a question, because we were talking about harvesting stormwater and rainwater and that sort of thing, especially in urban areas like within Melbourne. But I suppose the question I had, and I don't know whether any of you can maybe respond to this, is how is that if we're using stormwater and rainwater for other uses and not letting it flow into rivers and bays and oceans, etc., that will have an impact on the environment of those areas, won't it? Because I mean, that's how they've evolved, to have stormwater flow or rainwater flow into them.
I'm happy to start on this one. Mark, it's a really good question. I think for a lot of, so we've got a varying range of waterways in any urban environment, and they become degraded over an extended period of time. And they become degraded from two things. They become degraded from poor stormwater quality entering the waterways, as well as excessive flows. So we're finding in inner Melbourne, a lot of our waterways are basically beyond repair. And that's an acknowledgement that we've had to make. You've seen some instances where we're renaturalizing waterways, but we aren't necessarily changing the flow regime into those waterways. I suppose stormwater harvesting is becoming something more prominent in an outer metropolitan regions, because in the urban water, where those new growth areas are occurring, we're actually increasing flows and poor stormwater quality into waterways. So the fact of stormwater harvester playing a role there, we're managing environmental flows, but taking away those big peaky flows from stormwater that discharge from urban centres. And even from an inner city perspective, even when we do have schemes in the inner city, we still are maintaining environmental flows. But I suppose the recognition is that they're not natural flows that have always occurred within waterways, and we're taking away manageable limits. We're not taking away the entire flow into a waterway. So again, regulators are playing a pretty strong role in managing how stormwater harvesting is being rolled out across the state. We're playing catch up for a few years in the Millennium Drought, but I think now it's a pretty structured and well thought through process.
Great, thank you. So I'm conscious of time. We've got 5 minutes left, and I don't think there's any more questions at this stage. So what I may do is ask you each to maybe give a concluding statement, and I'll go in reverse order this time, and maybe I'll start with you, Tony.
Thanks, Mark. I suppose thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this morning, and I think that the challenges that are obviously in front of the New Zealand Three Waters agenda are quite large. But I think that if you adopt the approach of being sustainable and resilient businesses that are working for your community, your environment, and your stakeholders, then I think there's a great future, and look forward to seeing what develops.
Great, thank you. Helen?
Thank you. I agree with Tony. There are a lot of challenges that will be lay ahead. I would suggest, planning in advance is something that I highlighted. These things are best built in from the start rather than being added on as you go through the process. So it's looking at that blank sheet of paper and making sure that you've got all those things that are under the iceberg, plus many more, as part of your considerations. So best of luck. And thank you.
Great, thanks, Helen. Damien.
Yeah, again, thanks everyone for giving me the opportunity to present today as well. From a stormwater perspective, I think, particularly with this pandemic we're currently working through, the value of the environment and open space is becoming more and more prominent. So I think from my point of view, stormwater and understanding its value, both community, environmentally and economically, is really important. I think there's plenty of good work being done to justify spend in stormwater going forward. And I think the second point I'll make is bringing the community along the journey is also an important perspective, because that momentum generated by community, their involvement and participation in stormwater, is a key part of the mix, I should say, and mitigates against complete spends by authorities to do all the work when community is also part of that sort of nature rebuilding. So that's my perspective on it, Mark. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Damien. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We've got at least 2 more webinars planned for this side of Christmas. The next one will be about community and customer engagement, and we'll also be talking about local government here in Australia. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar.